Welcome to Taking Up Space, the podcast with conversations exploring what it means to inhabit our bodies fully, without shame or apology, and reconnect with our innate wisdom to find healing and body liberation. I'm your host, Cassie Krajewski, a licensed clinical social worker and certified sex therapist. For over 10 years, I've worked with folks to reclaim their bodies, their inner knowing, and their lives in a world that often seeks to diminish their voices and experiences. Through personal stories, expert interviews, and candid discussions with guests, we'll unpack the societal norms and expectations that interrupt our embodiment, like trauma, oppression, illness and pain, and the social constructs of gender, race, sexuality, beauty, health, and weight. My hope is that through this podcast, we'll learn to drop into our bodies and occupy space, physically, emotionally, relationally, and intellectually, with confidence and authenticity. So join me as we challenge societal norms, explore what it means to find wholeness, and reclaim our right to take up space as an act of resistance and body liberation. While this podcast might feel therapeutic, it is not psychotherapy and doesn't constitute a therapist-client relationship. This is a good time to mention, too, that this podcast will at times use adult language, so listener discretion is advised. Hey there, welcome to the first episode of Taking Up Space. I'm your host, Cassie Krajewski. I am sincerely grateful you're here and you're listening to this. Before we dive into this first episode, I do want to position myself as it's really important to acknowledge and contextualize my story and my lens that I'm taking to this podcast and even what I'm sharing today. So I'm a white cis woman, currently able-bodied, straight-sized. I'm middle class and highly educated. I hold several pieces of bodily privilege, which influence my story. This informs my lens, and it's an important part of my personal and professional learning and unlearning. It's central. So I wanted to acknowledge that and take the time to do that. So let me tell you about this podcast and why I'm here and why I'm holding this conversation. This podcast is all about our bodies, how we relate to our bodies, the stories our bodies hold and tell, the sociocultural context in which our bodies exist, the space they take up. Each of us has a body and our own unique relationship to it. While some of us have had a really positive experience of living in our bodies, many of us have lost a connection with our bodies, interrupted by trauma, oppression, illness, pain, and the social constructs of gender, race, sexuality, beauty, health, and weight. And as a result of those things, we're living with this relentless body shame, this disembodiment, this disconnection. And I really get that. As a therapist, I've walked with clients for the past 12 years to support them in their pursuit of reclaiming their bodies, inhabiting them more fully, and healing from the experiences and traumas that have separated them from their bodies. In my private practice, I most enjoy working with folks at the intersections of trauma, disordered eating and eating disorders, body shame, weight stigma, anti-fat bias, sex and pleasure. But even beyond doing this work as a therapist, I want you to hear that I'm doing this work personally too. I'm 15 years into my eating disorder recovery, and I'm still in process of reclaiming my right to take up space and unlearn my social conditioning around bodies and the general expectation that supplied my eating disorder. That I should act nice, not be too vocal, too loud, too dominant, too assertive, too needy, or just in general, too much. So I'm starting this conversation and this podcast from a place of being alongside you in the process. And there's this real inherent recognition that all of us, regardless of our path, are always learning and unlearning in the space of body liberation. The phrase taking up space can mean so many different things, but I do want to start off with an operating definition for this podcast. So to take up space means to shatter expectations by asserting your presence, your voice, your existence without apology or hesitation. Taking up space is about embracing and honoring your right to take up and occupy physical, emotional, and psychological space in the world, regardless of the societal expectations or norms. Taking up space involves owning your worth, expressing your truth, advocating for your needs and desires, It's a declaration of self-worth and empowerment, rejecting the notion that certain individuals or identities should shrink themselves, literally or metaphorically, to fit into some narrow societal construct. So instead, taking up space really celebrates the diversity and richness of human experiences, bodies, and wisdom, and acknowledges that every person deserves to be seen, heard, and valued in their entirety. Taking up space is your birthright. I want to tell you a little bit about my body story and how it impacts my journey of what it means to take up space. So for me, this birthright of taking up space got ruptured for me early on. As a kid, I grew up in a fat body. Starting in my toddlerhood and throughout my entire life, I've been fat, and I've had consciousness that I was fat pretty early on, and that fatness was a bad thing. One of my earliest memories at 3 or 4 years old was the recognition that my body at 3 or 4 was bigger than other kids, both in height and size and shape. And implicitly, I understood that size was not okay. It was wrong. And somehow I knew that I should be smaller. I remember really clearly before I went to preschool one morning, I was thinking about my belly, which was round and soft and full. And in my mind at the time, I thought I should have some kind of reason or excuse for why my belly was the way that it was. In my toddler brain, I thought, okay, if I said I ate a ball for breakfast and that's why my belly was so big, then, people wouldn't think less of me for that, or they would understand. That's what I did at school that day. I went to preschool. It's this crystal clear memory of telling my teacher this manufactured explanation of why my body was big, why my belly was round. There's this cover up at 3 or 4 for my budding body shame. I can't tell you how I came to the conclusion that having a big belly was wrong or bad, but it's not lost on me how clear anti-fat bias was from the very beginning of my conscious memory and thought. That anti-fat sentiment and fat phobia informed how I saw myself, my lovability, and my worth. That started from that age throughout my childhood, throughout my teenage years, as I continued to live in a fat body. And that resulted in a disordered relationship with food to try and control my fat body, which progressed into an eating disorder in my emerging adulthood. Elise Lunan writes in her book, On Our Best Behavior, women have been trained for goodness. Men, meanwhile, have been trained for power. This really resonates with my own lived experience. Self-denial was a pathway to goodness for me. I learned that smallness, obedience, submission, compliance were core strategies for me to somehow become more acceptable in my environment, atone for my fatness. And this translated not only to my body, but smallness and obedience in my voice, my emotions, my needs. I mean, it was very clear if I quiet those or shrink those and become more what others want me to be, I can find some semblance of belonging. And so that took being really observant of my environment and thinking, acting, believing like those around me and anticipating everyone else's needs rather than paying attention to my own. And it required ignoring my intuition and really just accepting whatever external answers I was being given, not questioning those critically. And even, like I said, it took controlling my body to take up as little space as possible so as to become more accommodating for others. And I carried with me a deep sense of shame and disconnection from my divine self, which left me sick, lost, disembodied. My body was a liability for me for a long time. It was too much, according to some. So it was better to control it, moderate it, cut myself off from it, live in my head, focus externally on what was happening around me, keep myself safe, small, docile, quiet, just cut off from my own experiences, desires, appetites, and agency. All of those were really secondary to my body being a desirable object, something for the pleasure and consumption by others, but it really was never my own. And all of these were survival strategies that, again, resulted in me falling into a strategy of an eating disorder. I really view my eating disorder now as a symptom of living in a body oppressive world, in a long legacy of anti-fat bias and weight stigma in my family and in my community and in our world at large. And to me, the eating disorder was my solution, not the problem, until it became a really serious problem and I got treatment for it. And let me tell you, I was the best client. I knew how to navigate that system of providers. I knew how to ascertain what they wanted for me to do or how to be successful there. I hustled, tried to be that perfect patient. So another manifestation of not connecting with myself, but really orienting outward, because it was still too scary for me to really embrace my inner knowing and my intuition at the time. It didn't feel safe enough to do that. It was too foreign. And so for the first few years after completing my eating disorder treatment, I would say I was eating disorder behavior free, meaning my relationship with food looked somewhat normal and peaceful from the outside because I knew how to be a good, compliant person in recovery. I knew the new rules. But internally, I was still wrestling with so much internalized fat phobia and resistance to accepting my body as it was. And also feeling it didn't feel very safe or okay to live in the body that I had post recovery, which was larger. So then, about 8 years ago, I was introduced to these concepts of intuitive eating and health at every size, which at the time felt really scary in a different way, but also very refreshing simultaneously. It was such a light bulb for me. I really couldn't believe what I was hearing with intuitive eating and health at every size. It just was such a radically different approach to recovery than what I had been doing up until that point. And it offered me more peace, more ease, more embodiment to my path. And it's through these models that I came to understand my personal belief now, which is our bodies hold so much wisdom in them, and they are really doing everything they can to help us survive and give us so much good insight. So I really started to drop into my body about 8 years ago, and I was able to start practicing tolerating going inside of myself in a way that I just hadn't been able to before. And while I was in my body, I became better acquainted with my voice, my desires, appetites, my inner knowing. Big shock. But this was a total different trajectory for me to turn inwards, drop my self objectification a bit more than I've been able to do before, and really listen to what was happening inside was revolutionary for me. And in that process, through the frameworks of health at every size, HAES, and intuitive eating, I learned more about diet culture. I began to see it everywhere. It was unavoidable. And I was really mobilized to deconstruct all of what I had learned about the goodness of bodies or what made a good body. And this was a really individualized aspect to my healing. It was still really personal and private. I wasn't recovering out loud. It was my own journey and reclaiming my embodiment that just didn't feel like I was able to share with others at the time. Things really shook up for me, though, when I was introduced to the book Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings. And that book taught me how anti-fatness was really rooted in anti-Blackness. So if you haven't read it yet, in the book, Strings delves into the historical roots of fat phobia, tracing it back to white supremacy, colonialism, and the emergence of racialized beauty standards in Western culture. And she argues that these standards have been used to control and oppress marginalized groups, particularly Black women, whose bodies have been demonized and policed throughout history. And Strings examines how the fear of Black bodies, especially those who have been perceived as large or excessive, quote unquote, have been perpetuated through various societal institutions, including medicine, media, and religion. And she highlights the ways in which fatness has been linked to moral inferiority and laziness, perpetuating harmful stereotypes and discrimination against larger body individuals, particularly women of color. And it was during this time that I also started to hear about the concept of body liberation, which went far beyond this whole concept of positive body image, which I had been introduced to through all of my recovery up until that point. But instead, body liberation really challenged and dismantled these harmful societal norms and expectations regarding bodies, advocating for acceptance, respect, and autonomy for all bodies, regardless of size, shape, or identity. And this called on me. This really spoke to something so deep inside that previously just felt untouchable. Like the freedom and liberation to be in my body and for all to have permission to be in their body was an incredible concept. So I was really mobilized by this. I started to learn all about all the ways bodies and marginalized folks had been controlled, oppressed, restricted across time and present day. In the US, we have the primary examples of genocide of indigenous people and colonialism and slavery and how bodies have been used as resources under capitalism. And when I was exploring this, it just revolutionized everything for me. It was suddenly not an individual process, but this was about all of us. And I learned so much from my teachers like Sabrina Strings and Sonia Renee Taylor in her book, The Body is Not an Apology, that without body oppression, we wouldn't need this body liberation. Neva Paran writes in her book that the body is the site of social control because our bodies are the location of our rights, agency, and freedom. And so bodies are also the ground for which we fight for liberation. This reclamation was something that shattered a glass ceiling for me in my healing, a place that I wasn't able to get beyond before in my own healing and my embodiment, envisioning a world where my body story and embodiment, it wasn't just about me and my process. This collective is what it was all about. Like my healing and liberation was bigger than me, but it also needed to include me. Learning from these teachers and fat activists that have gone before me, it just opened something in me to realize that body liberation is about all of us. We need each other in this work. And that is why I am here. That is the purpose of this podcast, is to invite us all into the questions of how do we liberate ourselves and unlearn all of the things that tell us that our bodies are sick, bad, disgusting, evil, something to be controlled, all the messages that we get from racism, transphobia, anti-fat bias, fat phobia that constantly bombard us that our bodies are something to be ashamed of or managed or controlled. We've all been indoctrinated into systems across our lifetime, across generations and intergenerational and ancestral influences about what it means to have a good body. And yet in this space, I'm going to invite us to challenge those societal and cultural norms. So we center radical inclusion, becoming so expansive in our acceptance that all bodies can find a sense of belonging as they are, including your body. Body liberation is something that is both an individual and a communal practice. Liberation for one person is bound to everyone's liberation. Embodiment is resistance, to reject the objectification and self-objectification, to drop in and reconnect with our bodies and our desires, and to give permission to live into those is an act of resistance. This is all happening in a culture that wants us to shrink and to be quiet, to be invisible, to be agreeable, and to refuse that is an act of resistance. And so this podcast, Taking Up Space, is all about that. We'll explore what it truly means for folks, specifically women and marginalized folks, to reclaim their bodies, their inner knowing, and their lives. We'll be exploring this work through personal stories and the sharing of lived experiences, bringing in experts and interviewing them on their areas of knowledge and specialization, and candid discussions with folks from all different experiences and walks of life. We'll unpack the societal constructs and expectations of gender, race, sexuality, beauty, health, and weight that constrain people's expression, intuition, and autonomy. Together, we'll learn what it could look like to embody our whole selves and truly occupy space physically, emotionally, relationally, and intellectually with confidence and authenticity, unapologetically honoring our presence and needs. Whether navigating personal relationships, professional settings, public spaces, or your own inner world, we'll provide insights and tools for your journey towards self-acceptance and empowerment. So please join me as we challenge these norms, dismantle systemic barriers, and reclaim our right, our birthright, to take up space, and as an act of resistance and body liberation. It's time to embrace the fullness of who we are without apology. So, thanks for tuning in. I hope you continue to listen and embark on this transformative journey together. Until next time. Thank you for listening to Taking Up Space. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and found it to be a resource for you in your own embodiment, healing, and body liberation journey. I hope you can continue the conversation with me over on social media by sharing your thoughts, offering your ideas and suggestions for future episodes, or just connecting. You can find me on Instagram at Inner Atlas Therapy. If you liked this episode and want to support the show, please subscribe, rate, and review the show in your preferred podcast platform. And share this episode with a friend. This ensures that more people can find the pod and will amplify our message of body liberation for all. If you haven't checked it out yet, I have a free Taking Up Space workbook available. This workbook will have you engage in self-reflection and embodied practices as you navigate your own journey of taking up space. You can find this free resource on my website, inneratlastherapy.com. I'll also link in the show notes some additional resources I've developed in my online shop to help you deepen into your own embodiment, healing, and body liberation work. Thanks again for being here, and until next time, I hope you join me in the resistance and find some ways to take up space this week. I'll see you next time.